What do you think we're going to find in these reports?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, this is the first time that the federal government has looked at crypto regulation from a comprehensive perspective. As you recall, President Biden issued this executive order back in March. He gave various federal agencies, both financial regulators and some non financial regulators, mandates to look at different issues, to look at some of the concerns we have with the space, but also some of the benefits that the crypto industry and sector could provide, and come up with recommendations about what types of regulation are needed going forward. So I think that we're going to see a fairly balanced analysis. I think we'll see some things around competitiveness and inclusion that the industry is going to be very excited about. I do think we'll see some concerns around, sort of the lack of regulation of dollar-backed stablecoins, which is something that has been discussed for a long time. Maybe the need for some spot market regulation. But overall, this should provide a pretty substantive roadmap for policymakers should they choose to accept it as they consider legislation this fall and into 2023.
Now, Blockchain Association has had a seat at the table with policymakers. How have they been processing this crypto winter and all of the drama?
Yeah, well, listen, I think, there's an understanding that crypto is here to stay, right? Like that wasn't always a concern. And even in this market downturn, I think policymakers have even more incentive to try to do something in the space, especially if you look at the beginning of the summer, we had the collapse of Terra Luna. We had a couple of bankruptcies. We had sort of the Three Arrows Capital. There were a bunch of events that had big impacts on consumers. And instead of pushing away from this space, policymakers said, all right, this is a space where we need to make sure that we fill regulatory gaps. We need to better understand what regulations already exist. We need to figure out what are the options going forward. And so, Congress has been pursuing several different bills this year. We saw the Lemus-Gillibrand bill earlier this spring. We've seen the Digital Commodity Exchange Act in the House. We have a new bill in the Senate that attempts to regulate this space. So they've been generating their own ideas. And I think, the executive order process and Congress's effort are going to converge quite nicely to have just an overall more educated policymaking group that is looking at this in a thoughtful, comprehensive way, in a way that moves the ball forward, but not so rushed that we get the policy wrong. And so
Right.
I think we're really setting the stage up to get a good bipartisan compromise and fill those regulatory
Kristin, but
gaps.
what about the agencies and regulators themselves? Because even though the executive order was seen as a really big step for the industry, a common critique I get when I'm talking to market participants is that it really emboldened each of the agencies separately, that there's a lot of conflict among them on how they define certain issues. Take the SEC and the securities issue when you come to Coinbase in particular. So do you see the agencies consolidating power to one agency or another? And how do you believe that Congress may enable that or conflict with that?
Yeah, well, the executive order did require cross agency collaboration on different topics. I do think the core issue out there when it comes to regulating the crypto markets, like particularly the Bitcoin markets, those that are truly commodities, is that today neither the SEC or the CFTC has jurisdiction in this space, right? What we need is Congress to come in and say, all right, we have this commodity spot market. Other commodity spot markets, like the grain market, for example, they don't have any federal regulator. So we need to find a new federal regulator to come in and regulate the spot market. And so I think Congress has a choice. What's interesting is that the three major proposals that have been introduced in Congress so far have all pointed to the CFTC as being the appropriate regulator for the crypto industry, probably because they already have regulatory powers over crypto futures and on fraud and manipulation in the underlying market. So I think that that's probably the place it's going to end up. It could also go to the SEC as well, but Congress seems to think that they want to give this authority to the CFTC.
And what does it mean for the SEC if more of that moves over? Because there's so many things that they were looking at, NFTs, other securities issuances potentially here. Do you think the SEC ultimately loses some power over these markets as they've already started on the enforcement path?
Yeah, well, I would argue they don't have any authority over, sort of the pure crypto commodity markets, right? I mean, the SEC has authority over things that are securities, and you can use blockchain-based systems to issue, equity, to tokenize shares of stock. When you have something that's truly a security, the SEC is obviously going to have a role to play there. I think the problem has been for innovators is that there really is a big gray area there. It's hard to know when they apply. And what we just need is a framework that addresses these concerns. And the stakes today are pretty high from a regulatory perspective, right? If you're deemed a security, you're regulated by the SEC. If you're deemed a commodity, a crypto asset commodity, there's no regulator at all. So I think by having a regulator, perhaps the CFTC, to regulate crypto commodities, then there's still going to be consumer protection. There's still going to be market surveillance. There's still going to be disclosures that help give consumers more information and investors more information. And so it won't be such a high stakes decision if something is a security or a commodity. So I think that will help pave the way for a more constructive dialogue. Once if Congress does indeed give the CFTC jurisdiction.